It was late, and the neon lights of the loop were vibrating against the glass of my office window. Eliza sat across from me. She wasn't your typical broken client who winds up in a private investigator's office. She looked sharp, dressed in a suit that cost more than my car, but her hands betrayed her when she set her bag on the table. They were shaking. She called him a living ghost. She told me Mark was still doing all the right things, buying flowers on Fridays, keeping up with dinner dates, but the intimacy between them had become mechanical, like an empty ritual. The moment she realized something was truly wrong was one night on the sofa. He'd fallen asleep, and she just wanted to move his phone so it wouldn't fall. The second she touched the device, he bolted upright like a snake had bitten him. He snatched the phone from her hand and looked at her with a gaze that was foreign, almost hostile. The look of a man guarding a fortress. She laid out the signs, one by one, with the precision of a tech executive. She said he could sit across from her for long stretches, his eyes locked on some distant point in space, as if he were running complex calculations in his head or remembering a conversation that happened on another continent. She noticed he'd changed every password in the house and installed encryption software. He started using encrypted messaging apps she'd never seen him use before. And then there were those nights, he'd wake up at 4 in the morning, not for the kitchen or the bathroom, but to lock himself in the study. When she asked, he'd toss out an excuse about working with the European market. It sounded logical given his job, but his tone was too defensive, too on edge. By the end, she broke a little. She told me she felt like she was going insane. She said she'd rather find out he was cheating with the neighbor downstairs, just so it would have a name, rather than continue living in this fog. Everything looked fine on the surface, but beneath it, a void had opened up that she couldn't decode. She wasn't just asking me to tail him, she was asking me to find the man who had gone missing inside her own home. She leaned forward, the scent of her expensive perfume mingling with the smell of the cold coffee that had been sitting on my desk for far too long. She whispered, as if the walls of my South Side office were listening, and said the facts weren't what scared her, it was the precision. She described how at dinner he'd laugh at her jokes, but the moment she turned her head, his face would collapse. She called it a mask of existential fatigue. As if he were carrying an entire world on his back that she hadn't been invited to. A week before she came to see me, she found a receipt in his coat pocket from a toy store in Cicero. Teddy bears, baby clothes. When she asked him, he didn't even bat an eye. He answered in a calm, almost icy tone that it was for a colleague's daughter. But that colleague had never been mentioned before, and no baby shower invitation ever came in the mail. She told me his lies had become too professional, as if he were rehearsing them in front of a mirror before walking through the front door. And then came the London thing. Suddenly he knew the weather there, dropped words in British slang that he had no business using, and started watching Premier League matches at odd hours. When I asked her if she thought he had someone there, she looked me dead in the eye and said it was deeper than that. She felt he was building a literal alternate identity, a brand new person, and that every time he came back to Chicago, he felt like a tourist in his own life. She called him a living ghost. She told me Mark was still doing all the right things, buying flowers on Fridays, keeping up with dinner dates, but the intimacy between them had become mechanical, like an empty ritual. The moment she realized something was truly wrong was one night on the sofa. He'd fallen asleep, and she just wanted to move his phone so it wouldn't fall. The second she touched the device, He bolted upright like a snake had bitten him. He snatched the phone from her hand and looked at her with a gaze that was foreign, almost hostile. The look of a man guarding a fortress. She laid out the signs, one by one, with the precision of a tech executive. She said he could sit across from her for long stretches, his eyes locked on some distant point in space, as if he were running complex calculations in his head or remembering a conversation that happened on another continent. She noticed he'd changed every password in the house and installed encryption software. He started using encrypted messaging apps she'd never seen him use before. And then there were those nights, he'd wake up at 4 in the morning, not for the kitchen or the bathroom, but to lock himself in the study. When she asked, he'd toss out an excuse about working with the European market. It sounded logical given his job, but his tone was too defensive, too on edge. By the end, she broke a little. She told me she felt like she was going insane. She said she'd rather find out he was cheating with the neighbor downstairs, just so it would have a name, rather than continue living in this fog. Everything looked fine on the surface, but beneath it, a void had opened up that she couldn't decode. She wasn't just asking me to tail him, she was asking me to find the man who had gone missing inside her own home. She leaned forward, the scent of her expensive perfume mingling with the smell of the cold coffee that had been sitting on my desk for far too long. She whispered, as if the walls of my South Side office were listening, and said the facts weren't what scared her, it was the precision. She described how at dinner he'd laugh at her jokes, but the moment she turned her head, his face would collapse. She called it a mask of existential fatigue. As if he were carrying an entire world on his back that she hadn't been invited to. She finished by saying she no longer trusts her own senses. She lies next to him at night, hearing his breathing, knowing his thoughts are in another time zone, in another house, with other people. She asked me to break through his firewall. She said the man she sleeps with is no longer the man she married, he's just a backup of someone else. I started with the bread and butter of the profession, classic street surveillance. I stuck to him from the moment he stepped out of his sleek building in the Loop. I burned hours inside the car, with cold coffee and a view of concrete, watching him go from the office to the gym, and from there to lunch meetings in quiet neighborhood cafes. Every time I thought I had something, that I saw him looking sideways or checking who was behind him, it turned out to be nothing. He looked like the perfect husband from the commercials, meeting friends from work, smiling, returning home exactly when the streetlights came on. It was frustrating. No mistress, no safe house, nothing but a routine that was boring to a fault. Then Eliza called. Her voice was trembling, not with fear, but with the excitement of someone who had found a breach in the wall. She had stumbled upon something in their family iCloud account. She told me the online backup storage had suddenly exploded. It had reached its full capacity. It didn't make sense to her. She had peeked at his phone gallery while he was showering, and there were barely a few photos of work and the dog at that moment. The penny dropped. I realized I had been playing on the wrong field. While I was looking for tire tracks on the road, Mark was leaving data tracks in the sky. His real life wasn't in his pocket, and it certainly wasn't on the streets of Chicago. It was locked inside a server somewhere, password protected, waiting in the cloud. I understood that the photos he deleted from his device every night, they didn't really disappear. They had simply moved to a different home. I sat in front of the screen in the back room of the office, windows closed, the only light coming from the monitor. Eliza had given me access, but typing in that password felt like opening a door to a house I had never visited. The data began to flow. Thousands of files pulled from the hidden backup, the kind Mark was certain no one would ever look for. At first, they were just folders with generic names like Project 2024 or Document Backup. But the moment I opened the first one, I knew I'd hit the motherlode. This wasn't just an affair. This was an entire life built in pixels. The first photo that popped up was of Mark. He looked 10 years younger, smiling inside a typical London pub with dark wood walls. Next to him sat a woman with an accent that practically shined through the photo, and they were holding a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. I kept scrolling. Hundreds of photos of trips to parks where the grass was far too green for Chicago, birthday celebrations with cakes from British supermarket chains, and videos of him teaching a little boy how to ride a bike on a street lined with Victorian houses. What hit me hardest was a video he took of himself in a bathroom mirror in London. He looked relaxed there, without the mask Eliza had described. He spoke to the camera, saying something about how he had to head back to work in Chicago soon, and that he already missed them. I realized this man was running an illusionist's schedule, syncing his life across 2 continents, deleting the evidence from his phone every time he boarded a plane, but forgetting that the cloud remembers everything. There were screenshots of British Airways tickets, WhatsApp threads long enough to be a novel about buying a house in the London suburbs, and even a confirmation for private nursery tuition in the UK. This wasn't some accidental move, it was a long-term investment. He hadn't just betrayed Eliza, he had replaced her with a different version of a life, leaving her in Chicago as a backup in case his European dream collapsed. I closed the laptop. I felt the weight of this information in my throat. I knew that tomorrow morning, when I met Eliza, I was going to destroy her world with one small zip file. I leaned back in my leather chair, and its creak sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the office. My fingers were still hovering over the keyboard, frozen. I've seen a lot of things in my career in Chicago, con artists, thieves, cheap cheats, but this was something else. I felt a slight nausea, the kind you get when you look too deep into an abyss. I looked at the photos of Mark with that boy in London, and I thought of Eliza waiting for him at the house in the Gold Coast, making dinner and wondering why his gaze was so distant. This wasn't just a betrayal case. This was the erasure of a human being. I felt like an accomplice to a crime, just by the mere fact that I was holding this secret now. Those folders, so organized, were like a ticking time bomb placed on my desk. I felt a quiet anger, the kind private investigators are supposed to learn to suppress. Mark didn't just lie. He operated an entire logistical system to steal the reality of 2 different women. I thought about the immense effort required to manage a life like that, the excuses, the flights, deleting messages every time the wheels touched down on the runway at O'Hare. It was a full-time job of sophisticated evil. I lit a cigarette, even though I had promised myself to quit long ago. The smoke curled in front of the screen, blurring the face of London Mark. I knew the moment Eliza saw this, the life she knew would evaporate. I was going to be the man handing her the noose for her marriage. There was a moment when I just wanted to delete everything. To close the laptop, tell her I found nothing, and let her live in the illusion a little longer. But then I remembered the look in her eyes, the way she said she felt like she was going insane. I realized that the truth, as painful as it might be, was the only cure for the madness he forced upon her. I stubbed out the cigarette in the crowded ashtray, dragged the files to an external drive, and felt the chill of the Chicago night seeping in. Tomorrow morning, the sun will rise, and I am going to break a woman's heart into pieces. I chose a small cafe on the waterfront, a place where the wind from the lake cuts across your face and reminds you that you're alive. Eliza sat across from me, her gaze locked onto mine, searching for an answer even before I pulled out the envelope. There were no unnecessary introductions. I placed the tablet on the table and opened the folder I had marked during the night. When I watched her go through the first photos of Mark in London, I felt the air in the cafe turn thick. She didn't cry. She simply froze as if all her systems had crashed at once. Her finger trembled over the screen when she saw the boy who looked exactly like Mark when he was little. I saw her connecting all the dots in her head. The flights, the strange hours, the British slang that once sounded like a joke to her and today sounded like betrayal. I told her quietly that she hadn't imagined anything, that she wasn't going crazy. I explained to her that the third party in their bed, the one that took up all the space in Mark's head, wasn't a woman living across the street or a fleeting affair in Chicago. It was the cloud. This digital backup was the true mistress, the place where he kept the life he actually wanted to live. Every pixel there was proof that while she was building a future with him, he was building a parallel world an 8-hour flight away. I looked at the lake waves crashing against the pier and thought to myself that this is the irony of this era. Mark was so careful. He changed passwords, he deleted messages, he locked his phone in a vault of fear. But he forgot that technology is no less treacherous than he is. It saves everything. It quietly backs up our sins, waiting for someone to type in the right code. Eliza looked up from the screen. Her eyes were empty, but the shadow of doubt had vanished from them. She closed the device with a sharp motion, and I knew at that very moment, Mark stopped being a ghost and became a target. I paid for the coffee, left her the hard drive, and stepped out into the Chicago cold. The case was closed, but I knew her war was only beginning. The last I saw of Eliza was her silhouette retreating toward her car, the hard drive gripped in her hand like a loaded weapon. A month later, the case was already the talk of the hallways in the Chicago courts, and I got my answers through official reports and one brief phone call from her. They didn't just break up, she dismantled him. Eliza didn't waste a single moment on unnecessary tears. She used all her tech expertise and the material I brought her to execute a surprise attack. She made sure a restraining order was waiting for him at O'Hare Airport the moment he landed from another business trip to London. He didn't even get the chance to step inside the house. All the locks had been changed, and his belongings were waiting for him in cardboard boxes at a rented warehouse on the outskirts of the city. I found out that Mark tried to play the victim, claiming it was a mistake or a data glitch, but against the online backup, he didn't stand a chance. Eliza sent all the materials, the photos, the wire transfers, the records of the house in London, to his lawyers and his partners at the firm. His double life collapsed like a house of cards in the Chicago wind. He lost his senior position, and the divorce settlement she forced upon him left him with almost nothing on this side of the ocean. The craziest part one learned? The woman in London knew nothing about Eliza. She was convinced he was working in Chicago on a temporary contract and that he was doing everything he could to move them there one day. Eliza, in a move of cold and calculated revenge, made sure to send her the backup as well. She wanted him to be left without a home on either continent. The last time I heard from Eliza was when she sent me a check with a generous bonus and a short note. "Thank you for finding the man I lost. Now I can stop looking." I understood then that Mark had vanished from her life for good. He probably went back to London to try and pick up the pieces, or perhaps he found himself a new city to invent another identity in. But in Chicago? In Chicago, he became a cautionary tale about the man who thought he could live twice and forgot that the cloud is always watching from above.